Hi, I'm Alan, and today I'm going to show you how I made this, my first ever chopping board. This is Rough Sawn Woodcrafts. I started with a couple of random lengths of sapele and ash, both of which I'd picked up at a local timber merchant. They were rough sawn and needed thicknessing as well as cutting to length. Then it was to the planer to get a flat face on them and start the squaring up process. I then switched the planer into thicknessing mode and got all the lengths to the correct, thickness. I'd planned on this breadboard being around 17 or 18 inches by about 11 inches, and then however thick the wood turned out. The thinnest was about 3 centimetres once plain, so the rest was brought to match that. I used the straight edge jig that I'd made to get a good side on each piece, so that I could use that up against my new table saw fence, that's one of my other videos, to get the other edge nice and straight, or at least as straight and clean as my cheap table saw would allow. I trimmed them all to around an inch wide. Actually, the sapele was about 3/4 of an inch and the ash was just over an inch, just to make it look a little less uniform. 11 widths gave me the overall width I was looking for, with a bit of play for some trimming after glue up if required. Then it was time for glue up. Not the most riveting part of the process to either carry out or, I'm sure, to sit and watch someone else do. Thank heaven for time lapse, eh? After removing all the clamps, did I ever mention that I'd never have enough clamps? I used a variety of planes and sanding to get rid of the bulk of the glue. There were some small gaps in the long joins between the strips of wood. Not sure if that's because I didn't plane each piece after I ripped into width, or perhaps a poor quality table saw or operator, but they were very small, so I filled them with a bit of wood filler. Once hardened, I sanded all the overflow off. Then it was time to trim the board to its final dimensions. I'd left the width a little longer than needed just in case I needed to trim it, but it was fine, so just cutting it to length using my sled on the table saw. Down to the last few cuts now, I decided I wanted to soften the edge of the board a bit and to make it easy to pick up. I didn't want to route handles on either side as I didn't want to risk ruining the first board as it was going so well, so I opted to run a 45-degree bevel around the whole thing. It was pretty easy to cut out all of these using the table saw with a combination of fence and sled. Last bit of cutting now, just a case of rounding over the top edge of the board with my handheld router and a round over bit. On to everyone's favourite pastime, sanding. To be honest, as it was pretty smooth already, it just took a quick pass with 3 grits, 120, 150 and 240 to get it lovely and smooth. Into the warmth of the house now, partly for comfort, partly because I knew it would attract dust like nobody's business. I finished it with mineral oil. I gave it 3 coats in total, wiping the excess off about 15 minutes after each. I was fairly generous with it, and by the third coat I could see that very little of the oil was being absorbed, which I think is a sign that it's absorbing plenty. Tell me in the comments if you think otherwise. Every day is a school day. Finally, I bought some nifty little rubber feet that just needed a small hole drilled in each corner, and they just sit in pretty solidly. I've never used them before, so we'll be keeping an eye out for whether they have a habit of falling out, and might stick them in with CA glue if they work themselves loose. It's at this point in a project that I would start thinking about things I could do differently next time. I can't think of anything obvious. I definitely want to get more adventurous with the types and the combinations of wood, as well as more complicated patterns, but wanted to get a fairly simple one under my belt, so I didn't consider routing handles or juice grooves or anything like that just yet. I do want to understand what caused the tiny gaps between the pieces and the glue up, so I'll look at my table saw and fence to see if anything could be improved there. And finally, some arty shots with some bagels for you to salivate over. This was packaged up, minus the bagels, and sent to my mother for Mother's Day. It was well received, I'm glad to say. Thanks very much for watching, and feel free to like and subscribe if you liked what you've seen. Cheers.